So Ephesians 2 and verses 11 through to 22. Now imagine there's no heaven. It's easy if you try. No hell below us, above us, only sky. Imagine all the people living for today. Imagine there's no countries. It isn't hard to do. Nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. Imagine all the people living life in peace. You may say, I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will be as one. Imagine no possessions, I wonder if you can. No need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Imagine all the people sharing all the world. You may say, I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you'll join us, and the world will live as one. Imagine what that would be like. Imagine a world where there is no division, and there is no disunity, and there's no hostility, and there's no conflict, and there's no fighting, and there's no arguments, and there's no friction, there's no alienation. Imagine all of the people living life in peace. Sounds wonderful, doesn't it? It sounds almost like a far-off dream that we would all love to happen, but a dream that is a bit too far, perhaps. And yet the truth of the Bible is of God creating a new humanity, a new community where there is oneness and peace and unity. For John Lennon, it can only happen if you get rid of religion. And yet we find out from the Bible that it can only happen because of the cross. Now, verses 1 to 10 and verses 11 to 22 are really like a mirror image in Ephesians 2. So you can put them side by side, and they're like a parallel. They're like a mirror. You look at one and you see the other. So verses 1 to 10 are all about God bringing us into a new relationship with himself. And then verses 11 to 22 is all about God bringing us into a new relationship with each other. Last week we said that you can ask 3 questions of the first half of the chapter. What were we? What has God done? And why has God done it? But actually you could change the last question to why has God done it to what has God made us to be? So verses 1 to 3, what were we? Verses 4 to 9, what has God done? And then verse 10, what has God made us to be? And you get almost exactly the same questions being asked and answered in the second half of this chapter. So verses 11 and 12, what were we? Verses 13 to 18, what has Christ done? And then verses 19 to 22, what has Christ made us to be? In verse 4, after the question, what were we? You have the climatic intervention, but God. And then in verse 13, again after the question, what were we? You have a similar climatic intervention, but now in Christ. We're going to look at those 3 questions in turn, and then I want to underline 4 things at the end. And as we go through the passage, looking at the questions and seeing the answers, I want you to be thinking, if you were trying to speak on this passage, what 4 things would you want to underline and bring out of it? So firstly, verses 11 and 12, we're thinking about the question, what were we? Therefore, remember, Paul says in verse 11. Remember, he says again in verse 12. He's getting them to do exactly as he got them to do in verses 1 to 3, and that was to think back to the past. So he's saying you've remembered what your relationship with God was like before you became Christians in verses 1 to 3, how you didn't have a relationship with God. You were dead. Your relationship with God was dead. He's saying you've remembered that. Now he's saying, as Gentiles, I want you to remember what your relationship was like with the Jews. And in verse 11, he's almost kind of saying, what was it again that the Jews used to call you? What was it that they used to call you? Oh, yes, that's it. They called you the uncircumcision. You Ephesian believers, they called you the uncircumcision. A circumcision, of course, was a physical sign that was cut into the flesh, given to Abraham and to the male members of the Israelite community as a sign of their faith in God's promises and of God's faithfulness to his promises. And yet over time, this sign of faith had just become a mark of national identity, a mark that distinguished them from the Gentiles, from everyone else. And so you had Jews and Gentiles. And the Jews, of course, did not like the Gentiles. They were hostile to the Gentiles. They despised the Gentiles. They used this term uncircumcision to label the Gentiles in a derogatory way. I listened to a quote of how a Jew saw a Gentile. The Jew had immense contempt for the Gentile. The Gentile said the Jews were created by God to be fuel for the fires of hell. God, they said, loves only Israel of all the nations that he has made. It was not even lawful to render help to a Gentile mother in her hour of sorest need when she's in labor, for that would simply be to bring another Gentile into the world. If a Jewish boy married a Gentile girl or a Jewish girl married a Gentile boy, the funeral of that boy or girl was carried out because such marital contact with a Gentile was the equivalent of death. So tremendous hostility between Jews and Gentiles. Not good relationships between Jews and Gentiles. Jews looked down on Gentiles. Jews despised Gentiles. And Paul's saying to these Ephesians, remember who you were. Remember your identity. Think back to what you were, you are. You're Gentiles. He's also reminding them that they were far off. Have a look at verse 13 and verse 17. Far off. They were far away. So in the New Testament, people thought in terms of relationship with God, in dimensions of space and geography. So you can see from my little complicated diagram, my Simple Simon diagram, if you lived in Israel, you were considered to be close to God. That was how it worked. And there are different references through the Old Testament that show that. Deuteronomy 4 and verse 7, for example. So Israel was the nation that God said he'd chosen for himself. Israel was the country where God said he would be, where his presence was. It was the country where his city was, Jerusalem. It was the country where his temple was, where he was worshipped. It was the place where he said his name would be. And to be in Israel was to be close to God. But if you lived outside of the borders of Israel, maybe in the land of the Philistines or the Midianites or Egypt or Babylon or Assyria, you were a Gentile living in a Gentile country, then you were seen as being far off. You were far away from the Lord. So far in Ephesians, we've seen the amazing blessings that are found of being in Christ. But you see there in verse 12 that the Gentiles had been separated from Christ. The Jews had this great expectation of the Messiah, but the Gentiles had no concept of the Messiah coming. You see there in verse 12 again that they had not been citizens or part of the commonwealth of Israel. They didn't have Israelite parents. They weren't descended from Abraham or Isaac or from the man Jacob who took on the name Israel. So they didn't share in all the benefits and blessings of Israel's heritage. Again, you see there in verse 12 that they were strangers to the covenants of promise. So those great covenant promises given to Abraham in Genesis in chapter 12, these covenants, these promises, they meant nothing to the Gentiles. They were strangers to them. They were unfamiliar with them. They didn't know them. Again, in verse 12, they didn't have the hope of the Jewish people. And again in verse 12, they were out there in the world, away from Israel. They were out there in the world without hope and without God. A people who lived outside of Israel and were Gentiles, not part of Israel, they were seen as being far off. They were far away. And Paul is saying to these Ephesians, that's exactly what you were. You're a Gentile. These are your roots. You were once without hope, and you were without God. And you know, for each one of us here this morning, it is exactly the same. Especially if you think in these terms, if you're not a Jew, you're in exactly the same position as these Ephesians. Tell me, whenever you read the Old Testament and you read the Old Testament stories and the narratives, the exciting encounters that you get in the Old Testament, and you try and find yourself in the story, because that's what you do. You read the story, you read the narrative, and you think, well, who am I in this story? What's my identity? What am I doing in this story? Where am I? Who do you see yourself as being? So, for example, in the story of David and Goliath, who are you? In the story of Israel v. the Philistines, who are you? In the story of Gideon against the Midianites, who are you? I think you would say that you're Israel. You're God's people. You're part of them. Or you think of passages where there are contrasts between Jews and Gentiles. And because so many of us have been brought up in Christian families, and we've gone to church since we were young, and we've known the Bible stories from an early age, and we've been to Sunday school, and we know all the answers that are ever asked, we align ourselves with the Jew, and we say, we're like the Jews. We're like the Jews in the story. We're like the Israelites in the passage. We're the ones with the spiritual background and heritage and history. And we forget that actually we're the Gentiles. From the Jews' point of view, we're the Philistines. We're the Midianites. In terms of our roots, we were separated from Christ. We were not waiting for the Messiah. We don't have Israelite parents. We're not physically descended from Abraham or Isaac or Jacob. We were strangers to the covenants of promise. In Old Testament terms, we had no hope and were without God in this world. And Paul is saying to these Ephesians, and God is saying to us, don't forget who you are. Don't take for granted God's grace to you in you being born this side of the cross. Don't forget that you're not just a sinner saved by grace, but you're a Gentile sinner saved by grace. This brings us to our second question, verses 13 to 18. What has Christ done? What has Christ done? Verse 13, but now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. You remember when some Greeks in John 12, they came to the disciples and they said, we want to see Jesus. And the disciples tell Jesus that some Greeks want to speak to him. And it's a real trigger moment in the Gospel of John. It's a real turning point in the Gospel of John, because up until that time, Jesus had kept saying, my hour has not yet come. But the moment the Greeks come to Jesus, people of other nationalities, Jesus says, my hour has now come. And in John 12, referring to his cross and the fact that these Greeks have just been drawn to him, he said, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. People of all nations. So the graphic looks more like this. A people who were far away, the Gentiles, they are now drawn in and they are brought near, not to the physical land of Israel, but to Jesus and his cross. And in Jesus and his cross, they have all these things that the Old Testament people had, the covenants and hope in God. You see, in Christ, Jew and Gentile have been reconciled together in the cross. They've been brought to the same place. So now it's not about whether you've got a physical sign cut into your flesh, or whether you live in the physical borders of the land of Israel, or whether you are a physical descendant of Abraham. In fact, in reality, it never was. It's whether you've come to God through the cross. You see there in verse 14, Paul talks about a dividing wall of hostility. There is so much in the news, isn't there, about walls and borders, whether it's Trump's plan for a wall between Mexico and the US, or whether it's what's happening on the island of Ireland and how Brexit will look, and borders, and how concerned people are that there isn't this separation. Because borders and walls, they divide people. And I think there in verse 14, Paul, he has in mind the temple in Jerusalem. And I've put up a simple Simon layout of the temple. You'll see that it's hardly to scale, but it kind of gives the general idea. So right at the heart of the temple, and imagine you're a Gentile living in the Old Testament times. Okay, so you're a Gentile living in the Old Testament times, and there right in the heart of the temple was this cube-shaped room called the Holy of Holies. And this was where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. And it was where God said he would most be. So it's the most holy place. It's the place in Israel where God was most present. And God, because God was most present in this room, only one person could go into that room on one day of the year. Only one person. And that was the high priest on the Day of Atonement. And then, of course, next to the Holy of Holies, you have the holy place. So you have the holy place where priests who had been chosen to fulfill certain duties, they could go into this place. So they could go next to the most holy place. And then, of course, a bit further away from the Holy of Holies, where God most was, you have the court of priests, where priests were generally serving and sacrificing and fulfilling their responsibilities. And then even further away from the Holy of Holies, where God most was, you have the court of Israelites, where Israelite men could go. So they could get that close to God, that close to the Holy of Holies. And then, of course, even further away from the Holy of Holies and from God, you have the court of women, or the outer court. And Israelite women could come this close to the Holy of Holies. And all these courts in the temple complex, they were on the same level. So they were on the same kind of elevation. But then outside of the main temple complex, and down some steps, and separated by two walls, you had the court of Gentiles. So if you were living in Old Testament times and you wanted to go to the temple, you could come to this court, and this was as far as you could go. So for you had to look up to the temple, and you had to look up to the Israelite people able to go to the temple, but that was as far as you could get. You couldn't actually get into the actual courts, and you couldn't get close to the Holy of Holies, and you couldn't get close to God, and you were treated differently to the Israelites. You looked up to them. And even if as a Gentile you were converted to the Israelite religion, you were still kept separate and you were seen as inferior, and the Jews still looked down to you in your Gentile court, and that was as far as you could go. And then on the wall that there was preventing you from going into the outer court, there were signs up in effect saying that trespassers will be executed. So if you were a Gentile and you went past that barrier into the outer court, you would have been stoned to death. You remember in Acts when people thought that Paul had taken some Gentiles into the temple complex. They went mad. They grabbed hold of them. They were about to tear them apart. They were physically going to kill them. And those Roman soldiers had to intervene because they thought that these Gentiles had come into the Jewish courts. And so there was this very real dividing wall of hostility between Jew and Gentile. But then if you look in verse 15, there was another barrier that separated Jew and Gentile as well. You have all the Old Testament food laws and ceremonial laws. Laws that the Jews kept, which they felt made them clean in God's sight. Laws which the Gentiles didn't keep, and therefore the Jews considered them to be unclean. And I think in verse 15, you even have to some extent the moral law that so many of the Jews kept to try and save themselves and look down on the Gentiles who seemed to be making no effort whatsoever. And yet, because Christ and his cross are a fulfillment of the temple and the Old Testament laws, and because the only true way a Jew or a Gentile can draw near to God is through him and what Jesus has done at Calvary, and because Jesus is the only way, verse 16, that anyone can ever be reconciled to God, and because Jesus, verse 18, is the only way in which anyone can have access to God, through Jesus' body, through his flesh, through his cross, Jesus has reconciled us not just to God, but to each other as well. You see there, verse 14, he's made peace. Verse 15, he's made peace. Peace on the vertical level and peace on the horizontal level. The dividing walls of hostility and separation, they've been broken down. They're like the Berlin Wall. It's been smashed down through the cross. In verse 15, you have a picture of two men fighting each other. And one man is a Jew and one man is a Gentile. And what Jesus has done through the cross is, in being killed, he has killed the hostility. He has brought these two men which were fighting and he's made them into one new man. And he's united them. You see there in verse 17, when Jesus rose from the dead, he came and spoke peace to those who are near, his disciples. And then when Jesus sent out his disciples into the world with the gospel message of peace, he sent them out, verse 17, to those who are far off. You think of Peter's spiritual journey through the book of Acts, starting to realize more and more that actually the good news of Jesus is not just for the Jews, it's for the Gentiles as well. And it takes him quite some time to get his head around that. And then it begins to dawn on him even more that in God doing that, God has brought Jew and Gentile together. You think of all the efforts for reconciliation that happen all over the world, the Northern Ireland peace process, the work that has tried to have been done to end the hostility in the Middle East, the tensions between different countries, whether it's North Korea or South Korea or Russia or the US or the UK or whoever it might be. And yet here we find alone is where true brotherhood is found. And it's found in the cross. Here is where true reconciliation takes place. And so we come to our third question, verses 19 to 22, and it's, what has Christ made us to be? What has Christ made us to be? Firstly, first half of verse 19, he's made us one nation. Paul says, so then you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens. On Friday, I looked up to see how many countries, nations there are in the world. That's how I spend my time most days, Googling interesting facts, or not. And I found out, according to the official records, that there are 195 nations officially in the world. 54 in Africa, 48 in Asia, 44 in Europe, 33 in Latin America and the Caribbean, 14 in Oceania, and 2 in North America. You can go home and tell your friends now. 195 nations. But if you really want to amaze your friends, you're going to say, actually, there are 196. They've missed one out. Because there is a nation that is not defined by geography or physical borders or race or language or color. It's a country that is made up of citizens from all over the world. A holy nation, Peter describes it. And not the physical land of Israel, but a spiritual nation made up of Jew and Gentile in Christ, fellow citizens, each with Jesus as their passport. All belonging together. God has made his people, Jew and Gentile, into one nation. Second thing that Christ has done, he's made us into one family. Second half of verse 19. But you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. And maybe you can remember back to that man called Paul Burrell, who started off being an attendant to the Queen, a personal attendant to the Queen, and then later became the butler to Princess Diana. And if you read anything that is written or you listen to him speak, it is astonishing. It is amazing to hear him describe what life was like for him living in the royal household, living in Buckingham Palace, walking past royal figures in the corridors, serving the royal family, having everyday normal conversations that you and I would have, having those kind of conversations with the Queen herself. And yet look at verse 19. It's not that we Gentiles have been made servants to God's family. We are God's family. And we've been made part of it in Christ, members of God's household, Jew and Gentiles together, brothers and sisters in Christ. And then you see thirdly in verses 20 to 22, what has Christ made us to be? He's made us one temple. This would have resonated with the Ephesians because they had the temple to Diana there in the city of Ephesus. It would also, of course, resonate even more because they knew exactly if they went to the temple in Jerusalem that they would have been kept back. They would have had to stay in the court of the Gentiles. And yet here Paul is telling them, he's saying, you're equal now. You're equal with the Jews. You can go to the temple to worship. And maybe they would have been thinking to themselves, well, maybe another temple is going to be built so the Jews can go to one temple and we can go to another temple and we'll be equal. We can have our own temple. And yet Paul is saying no. He's saying that it is just going to be one temple. You're both going to go to the same temple. And they must have thought, this is just amazing. And then it gets even more wonderful as it becomes clear, and Paul tells them that it's not that there's just one physical temple in Jerusalem that you can both go to, but you are the temple. God's new temple is you. It's the church. Have a look at verse 20. This temple, it's built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets. Linking that with chapter 3 and verse 5 and the order that Paul gives of apostles and prophets, I take the prophets to be New Testament prophets. In effect, Paul is saying that this temple, this church, is built on the foundational documents of the New Testament scriptures. Have a look in verse 20. Jesus is the cornerstone. A cornerstone was essential to the foundation. And it kept the whole building in line. It held it together. It ensured that the building didn't fall apart and it stayed in one piece. And that's the picture here of Jesus being the cornerstone, holding his people together, Jew and Gentile, as one and in unity. In verse 21, the whole structure, the whole temple is pictured, Jew and Gentile joined together, growing in Christ together because they're joined together in Christ. And then in verse 22, you have individual stones being talked about. These Ephesian Gentiles also being living bricks that have been built up and made part of the building. And they must have been thinking to themselves, I can't get my head around this. Before Jesus came and died on the cross, I couldn't even get close to the temple, let alone close to the Holy of Holies itself, where God's presence was. And yet now look at what's happened in Christ, verse 22. It's not just that I'm part of the temple, but I'm part of the Holy of Holies. I'm now where God's Spirit lives. God's people together is, in many ways, the Holy of Holies. It's where God's Spirit is. Do you see how privileged you are this morning? I've got 4 things that I want to underline to finish. And the first is that we are reminded from this passage let's have 2 together. There's only one way of salvation. There is only one way of salvation. For the Jew to be saved and for the Gentile to be saved, there is no other way of salvation. There is no other way. Verse 16 makes it completely clear that it's only through Jesus that you can ever be reconciled to God, whether you are a Jew or a Gentile. And Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. All the people around you, whatever religion they may be, the only way for them to be reconciled to God is through Jesus Christ. Secondly, dare I, the wonder of grace. The wonder of grace. If you're from a church background like I am, or if you're from a church family and you see someone from a non-church background or someone from a non-church family who wasn't brought up in Sunday school and didn't have Christian parents, sometimes there's this extra sense of wonder that someone from a non-church family has been saved. And then if someone perhaps from another faith who perhaps was a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist or a Sikh and someone from another faith gets saved, there's sometimes even an extra sense of wonder that someone from outside has been brought near, that someone who was a stranger to the covenants of promise is now trusting in them. And yet you see here that your salvation is no less special. And that their salvation is not more special. You too are a Gentile. You too were once on the outside. You too were a stranger to the covenants of promise. That's where your roots are. You too were someone who had no hope and were without God in this world. You see the wonder of grace. You see, thirdly, there should be no place for racism. There should be no place for racism in the church. You know that it's God's plan that in his new creation there will be people from every language and color and nation all joined together, brothers and sisters in Christ. One new humanity, one new community, one new family, one new people. No one treated differently to anyone else. And no one given preferential treatment. And no one discriminated. And that's the picture that we have here. You remember that the temple where Gentiles had to look up to the Jews and Jews would look down on the Gentiles. And yet here, Jew and Gentile, they're brought together. No one viewing themselves as superior. And no one seeing others as inferior. There is no place for racism. And then finally, peace and unity. Peace and unity. The peace and unity that there should be between God's people. If Jews and Gentiles have been brought together in Christ, then surely everything else that divides God's people unnecessarily, it should be finished under the shadow of the cross. Whether it's race or age or personality or opinions or denominations, all should be forgotten and left behind as we meet together under the shadow of the cross. This should be on the big level and it should be on the small level. So let me ask you how this works out in your life. After the service, who do you speak to? Does one nation speak to another nation? Does old speak to young? Does student speak to pensioner? All that divides us, it's gone under the shadow of the cross. And I think, if you will forgive me for this, I think there is a specific application for us here at HCC. Because previously we were two separate churches. We were HEBC and we were LFSBC, which is a lot more complicated to say. Over the past year, there has been this enfolding process, and God has so wonderfully worked, and his hand has so evidently been on that. And his grace has been so obvious to see. And yet, maybe there have been some things that, however you've felt about it, whatever church you were part of previously, maybe there have been some things that you've struggled with. And to be honest, I'll be surprised if there weren't, because we're all people and we all find some parts of change difficult. So maybe there are things in your heart that whatever church you were part of in the past, there is a small dividing wall. And you still see HCC as being two communities. There is this invisible dividing wall. Different people, different personalities you've had to get used to. Different sites and locations, different ways of doing things. People with different responsibilities that they now have or they don't have. Different problems and challenges. And these things, in an invisible way, they can be this dividing wall, and we can still see ourselves as being two communities, even though we come together. And yet it's here that we find our deep sense of unity. Not so much in terms of our identity or our strapline being one church on two sides, but rather our identity being one church in Christ. One man, one people, one family, one nation, one temple. United in Christ, reconciled to Christ, praying to the same Father, having the same gospel goals, going to the same place. One new community.